All right, guys.
Boys.
Welcome to our second July episode. Promptly in the middle of the week, we'll release this on Monday. So everyone will see it on Monday. What should we call it? Monday the 18th. But
18.
There you go.
there it is. There's the math. But yeah, this is gonna be a really cool episode. I know we've been talking about this one for a bit. It's on a subject I think almost any car enthusiast has kind of close to their heart in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not as much
Is it?
when they were younger, when you're like a kid. I think so. I think it's something
I
that
think people are super jaded about hypercars in general.
well, all right. Well, that's your own. You can say that for later. Um, in the meantime, we've all each taken a different time period of the. We're gonna go out hypercar. There's supercar, hypercar, mega car. It's just really expensive, really unnecessary.
Megacar is the dumbest name I have ever heard in my life.
I know. There's just a million different names for it, but at the end of the day, it means the same thing, and people trying to rationalize it really makes no difference. But Matt is going to first start us off. He's going to talk about the past and the history of this elite level of car.
Yeah.
Also the present day, and then Scott's going to talk about the future and future technologies of it. So, without further ado, we're going to have Matt just start us off.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the intro code. And yes, today's episode is about hypercars. I want to establish a couple of caveats before I get going. Firstly, I kind of fell down a rabbit hole. I started reading about like the early days of like, somebody beating a top speed record by like, tenths of a mile per hour. Just because I find it so fascinating. I mean, you want to talk about, doing 250 miles an hour in a Bugatti or, some of these crazy speeds. It's like these guys were doing hundreds of miles per hour on like, 28-inch wheels that are 3 inches wide on dirt. Like it, just their balls weighed as much as the steel engines that powered the vehicles. And the second caveat to build off of that is, I apologize, I didn't quite get to compile some pictures, but I really encourage you to take some time and kind of read up on one of the links that I provided. Maybe we can post that in the description at the end, because it really was pretty fascinating. But without any other caveats, I am going to share my screen and we can get going. All right, so the origins of the hypercar as we know it by a man with a nose. That's he wasn't around then, but we all love and adore it. So just like starting from the beginning, because I think it is kind of pertinent to the relativity of speed. So Mercedes came out with the first kind of gasoline powered vehicle in 1885. A few months after that, Bertha Benz took it on a 14-mile trip with a 3/4 horse engine, and honestly, like very quickly after that, the kind of racing mentality made its way into the automobile. I mean, people had been racing steamboats, which killed hundreds of people at a time. People have been racing steam engines. So it was only natural that started racing cars. So, again, kind of keeping things in perspective, it's like that first Mercedes did like, I think 6 miles per hour. So, these cars were really, really slow, and they had like, I don't even know, like jars as fuel tanks. So it really started off super archaic. I know this is kind of jumping a bit ahead, but I think it's also really interesting that it's going to essentially come full circle. But the first recorded, first fastest flying kilometer was the Chantal Duc, however you say that. I don't speak French, but it was an EV. And then it broke its own record 4 more times in like the consecutive, essentially 5 months, because they just kept tweaking the motors. And then, as you can see there, between 1898 and 1901, it held that title until Mercedes came back with another gasoline powered vehicle, the 35 horsepower. Also, interestingly, about the Mercedes 35, that was pretty revolutionary because it was the first vehicle that was kind of sat in and not just like on top of, not just kind of like the horseless carriage type look that you kind of associate with those ancient vehicles. I also think
it's way less sketchy in general.
Yeah, exactly. I also think it's really funny that like it's regarded as like this high performance vehicle because you sat in it and they made it longer and a little bit wider and tried to get the engine lower, which like obviously anybody who understands any sort of like, physics and engineering, like that's a given, but it took them, almost 10 years to kind of figure that out in terms of designing horseless carriages. Moving on, so the 100 miles per hour barrier was broken in 1904, which again, like, not quite 10 years, but pretty quickly we got to going fast because people really wanted to go fast. So I thought that this was a pretty interesting stat. So the 100 miles per hour, the flying kilometer, was 21 seconds, and that Jean Todt that did 39 miles per hour was 57 seconds. So like that's a pretty big margin. I mean, you would definitely notice that. This statistics here, the 1913 Talbot, also again really impressive. Actually covered 100 miles per hour in an hour, not just hitting 100 miles per hour.
Where did it possibly do that?
Somewhere in France. I can't remember exactly, but again, it's like, there was barely 100 miles of like smooth paved road in 1913. So like,
yeah, that's why I'm like, where did they do this? Like, the salt flats?
Yeah, bouncing off your bottom is mental. I wish I had more time to kind of expand upon the Duesenberg caveat, but Duesenberg was really one of the innovators in terms of taking like essentially what would be production race motors and dumping them into street cars. So they were taking race motors from drag cars and drag boats and then building like, the Model J and the Model SJ around these cars, around these engines, which was, frankly, incredibly impressive. The engineering feats that Duesenberg pulled off was really incredible. But again, we'll kind of just keep moving past that. I would encourage you to read into Duesenberg.
We got to do a episode on Duesenberg. I think.
I could go on for hours about them.
With that point, do you consider Duesenberg, is that like the first hypercar in the world? Like, of its time, was it such a drastic step that it would be?
It's a good question.
Honestly, like, yeah, and I like kind of unfortunately discounted that more than I wanted to because I was like, oh my God, I'm gonna get stuck like before 1935. Like, this is just gonna take way too long if I really kind of try and hash everything out. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, like you have this 1913 Talbot that covered 100 miles in 1 hour, but it's like, similar to, I think it was 1905 or maybe 1909, Henry Ford basically commissioned a race car, and it was a 1,000, no, not 1,000. What was it? I don't remember. Some ridiculous massive engine on literally what was a ladder frame with a seat, and it did like 99 miles per hour. And it's like, okay, yeah, like, you have race cars that go really fast, But the Duesenbergs, like in all seriousness, to your point, were like street cars, were production vehicles that hauled ass. I mean, they
It was
probably
like the first, like kind of maybe not the first, but it was on the end of like the refined hypercar, right? It's
yeah.
not
I mean,
just
it
strapping a
was
rocket to.
yeah. I mean, it was the first. It was really the first usable, like fast vehicle, the first kind of production hypercar, and the first kind of mass like what's the word I'm looking for, like I guess you could say reliability, right? Like these other cars, it's like they had just enough fuel to sprint 2 miles so they could do the standing mile. And
That's the same way. I mean, not to interrupt you here, but that's like we're not taking into consideration like land speed record cards, right? We're not doing
no
Bloodhound or anything like that. And when we're having these sort of conversations, but Duesenberg was a road car.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Duesenbergs had 3-speed transmissions, and in their third gear, they could comfortably sit at like 95 miles per hour, which for early 30s is crazy. But again, like I said, I could go on and on and on about Duesenbergs.
You're more than welcome to. We can have an episode directly about this, and we should talk about this more. I mean, that's kind of like what this platform is built for. But my question here, and I don't want to jump the gun too much on this if you're about to talk about it.
Yeah.
But where did Duesenberg like compare to Bugatti at the time? Because early 20s and mid 20s was sort of like when they were starting to release.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to think. I guess if I could provide a more modern translation, it would be something to the equivalent of like this might not be a direct translation, but like CTSV versus like Alpha 4C. When you think 1920s Bugattis, you think like the 1929 oh my god, I'm blanking on the name.
Type 35.
Type 35, yes, thank you. Type 35, which is like the size of a bathtub, and it had this rinky dink that's not the right word. It had a very small supercharged straight 8 engine, and it was very much the kind of light and fast method. These Duesenbergs were like giant commissioned steel bodies that were probably somewhere in the neighborhood of like 4,200 pounds for a coupe to upwards of like 6,000 pounds for like the full body sedans with the trunks on the fixed trunks on the rear. So it was essentially like a freight train on the road.
Well, that's just the different philosophies of how Europe approaches things and how.
Yeah, absolutely. But the same ideology is there. Straight 8-cylinder, supercharge it. Juice it up as much as you can, and go as fast as you can for as long as you can, kind of thing. But I mean, does that answer your question?
It sort of does. I'm just curious about like where this like stands, because obviously at the same time period they both existed, and while they're two different like ways of looking at the hypercar, it's not it's not a set definition, right?
Exactly. And that honestly made kind of exploring the origins really difficult, because there is really no set definition of hypercar. That's not really something that we were able to kind of typify until I want to say like maybe the 2010s or so. But I'm going to keep moving, and we can come back to that if you want, because that it's definitely something that I was continuously thinking about as I went through kind of some of this background. Again, I also apologize that it's kind of just plain white and not that fancy, but so again, kind of jumping forward and keeping in mind the race car versus production car versus land speed record, because technically you don't really want to discount that. I mean, that counts for something. But so, you know, the 1930s, you had things like the Duesenberg. The 1940s, you had things like the XK 140 and, you know, the XK 120 and, you know, racing against the Flying Scotsman. And there, I mean, again, you know, I could go on about the Bentley Blue Train, and there are a gazillion and one versions of, you know, car versus this, or, you know, car versus car, et cetera. But bringing it up to the 1950s, that's really when you started to see cars that were production built, that were very fast, that were you know, essentially reliable for modern definition by that time. So, you know, 1955, you saw the 300 SL with you know, it's big torquey straight six, and with the taller gearing, it did 163 miles per hour, which is among, you know, some of the fastest of production vehicles for that time. On the race car side, you had the D type, which again, 3.7, 3.8 liter straight six, 4-speed, you know, teeny aluminum body, and it did 170 miles an hour, but that's a race car. That wasn't a street car. So, you know, the kind of engineering was really propelling people, pun intended, to extremely high velocities. But it was, you know, there's a big difference between street cars and race cars, especially as we got into the 1960s. So the Dodge Daytona race car was one of the first vehicles to hit 200 miles per hour. But again, that was the race car. The street car version was a lot slower because it didn't have the race car engine. But in terms of street cars, you had the Daytona, which is, you know, beautiful vehicle, widely regarded as, you know, probably one of the greatest Ferraris. And you had the Miura, which I put the asterisk next to 170 because, as we all know, the front end started to get heavy, so no one really knew what the top
light
was. Or yeah, excuse me,
the opposite.
The front end started to get light, so no one really knew what the top speed was because he didn't want to take flight. But you know, the technology, you know, kept getting better, kept getting more accessible, and it was, you know, there's a lot of really interesting history between, you know, who was trying to kind of push the needle that much further. The 1970s is really interesting because that's when we saw not only like the gas crisis in America and a ton of cars that were, you know, kind of choked out by their carburetors and various emissions and whatnot. But it really, the 1970s really didn't do a lot for essentially hypercars for the street. You had the Countach that entered the market, one of the very first variants that are, you know, now rocketing up in value, did 179 miles per hour. Notably, the 512 BBI did 186 miles an hour. But you know, you had like the Pantera that was kind of in that range, and a couple of other muscle cars that kind of hung around that neighborhood. But when you really think that, you know, by 1969, the 365 GTB was doing 180 miles per hour, and you know, by 1989, when you had the Countach anniversary, it was doing like 187. You know, it's kind of nominal at that point. We really began to fight for the small increases. But the 80s, the late 80s, you know, brought us to kind of what became the first area of the hypercar. So as we all well and know and love, you had the F40 versus the 959 battle. So the 959 came out. It was tested at 197. and then they were able to get it to 200 on a racetrack. So Enzo, being the kind of spiteful Italian man that he is, got the F40 up to 201.1. So he was happy to die on his high horse with that. And then kind of the I guess modified, kind of the tuner market in the 80s really started to take off. Obviously we had Zender and Gambaya and all these crazy cocaine body kits and stuff, but performance wise, it really started to ramp up as well. So we had the rough Yellowbird, the first version, the famous 930 variant, was able to do 211 miles an hour, which is fast. That car is really light, and you can really get pretty jazzed up watching the famous footage of it slide around the track, and just like how kind of sketchy that must have been. Also notably the Alpina B10, so that was the one of the variants of an E34, was brought to 180 miles per hour, which is very fast for a sedan. The next closest competitor would have been the Lotus Carlton, and that was about 10 years later. Interestingly, it was also a twin turbo inline six. So the first hypercar was, of course, McLaren F1, 1995. It was the fastest car in the world for basically 15 years. The Koenigsegg CXX was able to nudge it out by like 1 mile per hour, just over 1 mile per hour, in 2005. But at that point, it was borderline prototype car. I think there was two. Christian von Koenigsegg had one, and then they had a second one that they like didn't smash.
CCR, right?
Pardon me?
CCR, that was the car.
Maybe I could have swore I read it as CCX, or instead of did I have a typo there? It might have been the CCX, not the CXX. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
There was a really, really, really early Koenigsegg car before.
I think it was a CCR, but I could be wrong because it was like the first that didn't, or maybe it still used the Ford modular general architecture, but the CCX then beat it by
there was the CC8 S, which was like the 02
that one didn't beat it.
But so $1 million brand new in 1995. Obviously, that is a ridiculous amount of money. Then it's a ridiculous amount of money today. But we'll come back to that in just a little bit. 106 units in total. I forget the exact breakdown, but it was like I think there's like a couple of the LM cars. There's a couple of the GTRs. I think like 5 of the GTRs. But I thought it was. I mean, this is kind of just a personal anecdote, but I find it really interesting that it was, so fast as a street car, but then they also made race car versions of it that were essentially the same thing. Just, one had a wing, one had they had the long tail, and it was, wasn't that changed to become a race car. Also interesting that, kind of originated as a street car and then became race car, and not the other way around, where it's typically like, okay, we want to go racing with this car. Okay, we got to build 25 or 250 or whatever to make it homologated. Exactly. So then we get to the 2000s. So maybe it was the CC8S that you guys were thinking of. That was one of the really early Koenigs. Did 240. 2005, you had the Celine. Koenig came back in 06 with the CXX, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, was the first Koenig that didn't have the modular motor. I believe the CC8S did. But that was 249 miles an hour. And then in comes the Bugatti. I have a slide on that next, so we can cover a little bit more about that. But you know, as you can see there, it's the successor to the F1. That's kind of, if the F1's Hypercar 1, the Bugatti's Hypercar 2. And then again, kind of teetering on like the land speed record, kind of one-off versions.
Kit car version.
What's that?
Basically a kit car version.
Yeah, exactly.
LS.
You had the ultimate aero, so it's like, you know, in 1927, when the first car did 200 miles per hour, it was like, you know, they had airplane motors with a body around it. So it's like, you can kind of just extrapolate that to be the same thing. But I wanted to toss it in here because I guess, you know, I would say it's an honorable mention, if you will. So we could spend an entire episode on the Bugatti Veyron because it's absolutely captivating, both engineering wise and in looks. I know that all three of us could not stop Googling at the one that was at Drain in Rhode Island, in that incredibly simple gray, silver, and gray spec. So the first designs began in, I think it was October of '98. They wanted to have essentially a render prepared for the Paris Auto Show for '99. But that was shortly after Volkswagen took over. So it did not take them long, took over Bugatti, right? It did not take them long to start working on kind of a respective, you know, Bugatti successor to some of their previous race cars.
Sorry to interrupt, but this was for an MPX like idea to create the Veyron, correct? This wasn't internal, because if we just scroll back to EB110, like that wasn't, I believe that was under VW ownership?
No,
it was pre-VW, that's correct. Yeah, so I was gonna try and incorporate it, but I didn't want to just like start dropping stuff in that I couldn't really speak to. But they had a bunch of the prototypes that Bugatti started to put together, or Volkswagen, whatever you want to label it as, started to put together before they came out with the Veyron, were EB variants. So one was like the EB18 and pardon me, EB118, and they started to kind of go with those different iterations. But they ultimately just decided against it, just going with the Veyron as an homage to Ettore Bugatti, and then obviously the 16.4 is for the W16 displacement.
And four turbos.
Yeah, I still think that this little anecdote, well, it's not an anecdote, this tidbit that I put with 10 radiators is just like, I mean, to if you were to try and sum up like how like extra,
I think that sounds absurd to non-technical people,
right?
But like all that is to me is it reads almost like a heavy-duty diesel truck.
Yeah,
like,
and
where you have coolers everywhere.
That's the crazy thing. You know, I think from
it doesn't actually. No, I'm looking at. I don't mean to interrupt, but I mean, if you look at F10 M5, it has one. Well, it says oil rated. That's just like oil cooler. Okay, but it has one for almost every single one. It has two. Well, it might even have. I mean, even my M4 has two air to liquid intercoolers, and I think one or two, and then one for each one of the rest. So maybe there's probably 8. But
yeah,
I'll have to do the math on it. But it is, I think so. They went to 11 on the Super Sport, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It's strange how they have 3 heat exchangers for the intercoolers when there's actually 4 turbos. So they must be splitting it somewhere. But
yeah.
It's also funny to me that they only have one differential oil cooler when there's 2 diffs.
Yeah,
Bugatti.
exactly. So, again, we could spend so long on the Bugatti and its, engineering feats and production feats and et cetera. But as you guys are kind of dissecting this, I think that, again, that's like, it's a great like area to focus on as to what the Bugatti Veyron was, because it's like, okay, yes, it had 1,000 horsepower. Yes, it was 4-wheel drive. Yes, it was, 4,000 pounds and leather lined, and it was actually comfortable. And albeit you get single digit gas mileage, is almost usable. But it's like, okay, yeah, it's 4-wheel drive, but it only has one differential cooler. But it's just like, I find it really interesting that it's like, okay, they were able to make such incredible achievements and hit 253 miles per hour, but it's like there's still things that are shortcomings, or that seemingly like don't really make sense.
I don't know if there's that many of them. It's pretty impressive piece of engineering, but
yeah, exactly. And then kind of code, as you were saying, it's like the fact that your car has maybe one or two less kind of cooling tidbits, and it's 10 years newer is
yeah, but it's also BMW, so they don't all work all the time. The cooling system.
That is a very big asterisk on that. But I'm gonna keep moving here. I could go on about the Veyron for so long. It's just such a.
It pioneered it answered a question no one was asking, and it set the bar for basically until probably the late 2010s.
Yeah, exactly.
About the same question. I mean, people just. I'll touch on it in a bit, but it's really cool. It's a question no one has asked. Had answered, or a question, it answered a question no one asked, and it set a staple that I think is underappreciated now by a long shot, but in the future will be seen as like quite monumental, because
and it also increased power by 40% by the end of its production, which is insane,
crazy. And to make it like quote unquote reliable for what it can do, day in, day out, you can basically just launch it and then it hits 250, and then you come down and you can go to your local Stop and Shop and just do everything that you could have. You can't really do that with a McLaren F1. Couldn't do that with any of the other previous hypercars.
Yeah, exactly.
But you can carry one more person in a McLaren F1, so it's that much more practical.
That's true. Wife and mistress.
Yes, yeah, exactly. For motoring around con. But I mean, great points, excellent additions. I certainly appreciate that. So maybe we can tack these into the description somewhere. But this first bit was, again, so fascinating. I was having a hard time not like reading every single description, but it really goes into depth about some of the early days of fast cars, and basically the bends through probably the early 1920s. It kind of discusses every single record break, and then again, just kind of notably, I know you brought up the land speed record in March 1927. It was more or less a land speed record, but it was this 1,000 horsepower. I want to say Merlin engine, but it might not have been a Merlin engine, airplane engine powered monstrosity that did 200 miles an hour. So I know that was a little bit spotty. We kind of jumped all over the place, and there again was some kind of, that got real dark. Brakes, but as we discussed with the Veyron, that was probably the first hypercar as we know it. So everything prior was really kind of trial and error stages to getting there. I'm not sure if you guys have any points, but other than that, John, the stage is yours, and I'm gonna go flick a light on because I'm sitting.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I was just gonna make fun of you. I was like, he's just gone, disappeared.
Back in 1927.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you light a wax candle, or actually kerosene would be great.
Whale oil. He's in Boston now.
Give me the whale oil. I do. So I'll give you 1 second to come back here, but I will applaud you for what you did, because you possibly had the hardest job of the three of us, because you had to like cover over 100 years of history.
Yeah,
And
so I hope I did an
cover.
okay job at that. Like I said, it was so hard to kind of like
It's really hard.
not get hyper focused, but I didn't want to make it too broad. So
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. We'll touch into, but there's just so much there. We're gonna do a pre-war period.
I would love that.
A 60s era. We're gonna touch on all those. So we got the spark notes. I will
60s would be fun.
Before I get into mine, I want to ask you a question, because I kind of got the sense from your presentation that, you know, top speed, it's a really easy benchmark to compare cars against, and it
Absolutely.
really is in a lot of ways how we as humans just define, like when we're 5 years old, how we define what is speed, like what is a car, like how good is it. We need to put into elementary terms, and it's like, how fast can a car go,
Right.
is typically how we start off. But if I were to ask you, and you can take as long as you want to like think about it and explain it, what does a hypercar mean to you, and like how has it changed through the years? I think like we'll end on that note as a thesis, and then I'll talk about my part.
Yeah, that's a great question. Just on the fly, I mean, do you want me to come up with an answer now, or do we want to each answer this like at the end of the episode?
If you want to think about it, we can totally do that.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I would like to
Yeah.
take a couple minutes and not just leave a big
No
pause.
problem. So we'll end on that at the end. We'll like revisit what it means.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I'm going to touch on my part, and so you graciously ended us at, let's say, Veyron. You know, now financial crisis 2007 2008 happens.
Yeah, I mean, Veyron production kind of brought us through into the 2010s with all the super sports and stuff like that. So
and it was interesting, and like talking about the F1. There's a great podcast from Talking Cars with Chris Harris about I think it was the salesman at the time of the McLaren F1, and they had just come from a recession. Selling $1 million car at the time is pretty much unheard of. Like, really, no one was doing this. I mean, there's some examples of Ferrari 250s, but obviously they didn't hit $1 million. $1 million was Elon Musk money at the time.
yeah,
But the idea of showing wealth to this degree in a form of a vehicle was kind of unheard of. So selling a McLaren F1 was much more difficult. Nowadays we'll have short releases, Lamborghini Centurion, you name it,
right.
$3, $4, $5 million gets sold out in like a business day. And that idea, which had originally started with F1, then got to the Veyron, those weren't selling like hotcakes. Those took a while to sell.
Yeah, I mean,
now
what was it? The first 2 years they lost money on every single one or something.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, but I think the Veyron changed people's perception of it, because the McLaren F1 and 959 were like famously a pain in the ass to own.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and Veyron's a pain in the ass to own. But in like
luxury is not it being a pain in the ass to own it. Yeah. The Bugatti, well, the one thing Bugatti does do well is they had very limited service centers in the US, but they put together really good concierge. So that inconvenience and the expense, if you could afford it, wasn't as much of a hassle as like a 959 in the US.
Yeah,
100%.
definitely.
Like it just wasn't.
They got that.
And if you listen to like Bruce Canepa talk about the 959 like back in the day,
it came as a show car.
Yeah, like it required effort. They had to fly people to service it, and it was such a pain, and it was so expensive to service, and there wasn't the infrastructure for it. So people just didn't want to put up with it. Like they would ditch the car because they didn't want to put up with it. And I think Bugatti, the part that's overlooked is that they solved that problem of insanely complex servicing,
which
it gave people confidence.
Credits due. It's got to be Volkswagen inspired. I mean, you can't have something, especially someone like McLaren in the 90s, which had just built race cars. They don't know what to do with servicing. And then Porsche bringing a car that wasn't supposed to be in the US in the first place. Not only with the 959 and McLaren F1 did you have to be uber wealthy, which was a given, you also had to be a psychopath to own one. Whereas like Bugatti, and to your point, Scott, it's like all you have to do is really just be wealthy, right? It's just money at the end of the day. That entry point. You don't have to also be a hardcore enthusiast. Like if we were all billionaires, we'd all be McLaren and F1 enthusiasts in the 90s. But like most people that are just like making that sort of money, they don't want to, like, they don't care. They really don't care about having, you know, a McLaren F1 driving experience. Oh, this is what Gordon Murray does. There's a few.
When their accountant comes to them and says, "Hey, it's going to be $200,000 to get your car serviced," you're like, "I don't want to do that. Get rid of it." Like,
yeah, or just liking the small, really nerdy engineering bits that, you know, a lot of people just don't care about.
Right.
The money is one thing. I mean, that's like T-Pain famously sold his Veyron because like an oil change was like 25 grand or something like that. But
T-Pain also is like a Nissan 240SX enthusiast, and like, that was just probably a whole nother level. And he's
that's
like,
true.
I can fix my 240s for a penny. This is crap.
That's true. He's like, I'm just gonna be grassroots from now on. But I mean, he was not the exception. That's a huge reason why you don't just see Veyrons all the. I mean, go to a Cars and Coffee, you'll see a Koenigsegg before you see a Veyron. So so anyways, I'm gonna dive into mine. I think it was a good introduction to it. Let me see if I can get this right. You'd think I would learn how to do this by now. Okay. Alrighty. So present day hypercar. So we're gonna start off. We're gonna segment it and dive a little bit deeper. My window is much shorter than Matt, so my job is a little bit easier to talk about this. But basically, there's three main forms of propulsion. There's pure internal combustion engines, hybrids, and full EVs, which is what we're seeing. And the big thing I want to touch on is how we sort of like look at these vehicles and sort of what they're built around. And there's no formal definition, but this is kind of how I see it. So there will be technology, which is quite obvious, but it can be seen in different ways, right? So we're going to see, as you saw in that first slide, a Valkyrie. There's, you know, you want to use the latest materials, the latest material sciences, there's processes, latest software, latest whatever you have to build, you know, a hyper. I mean, a cost, no expense. We're not talking just Ferrari F8s or SF90s. We're talking million, 2 million plus, where it really, like, money just is not is no object. The art form, which is a more subjective type, which is just, you know, how they look, how they make the buyer feel. They have to, it also obviously ties into the culture, which is I sort of seen as like historical relevance, right? Porsche is gonna always treasure the 911. You have your 935s, which are like historical references. You have like Bugattis, which have changed throughout the time, but we have like these brand identities, which each brand has been very specifically curated to appeal to the masses, or in this case, to the very few. So I segment in these, and they, as I go through this like quick presentation, we'll see how each one of these manufacturers ties into each one of these like three pillars. So as I mentioned before, internal combustion engine and hybrid and EV. And we're going to just start off with internal combustion engine. It's been the standard for the last 100 years. As Matt was like talking about, it's what we've become used to. It's what all three of us, Matt, Scott, and I, have known since the early 90s or mid 90s. I have the Chiron and the Jesko. I'll talk about the Chiron first because Matt brought up this point of the Veyron, and really the Chiron is that formula just evolved into the modern day. The formula is the same of how it's being proposed with a 16-cylinder quad turbo W16 that's meant to reach incredible heights of top speed, but also being luxurious and daily drivable, I guess. The Jesko, which is based on if you just like derive it from its origins of a like Koenigsegg CC8X maybe, or CC8S,
more or less.
It's
more or less.
It's a tube chassis with a really big engine and some carbon fiber. Like having poured over one for a while, I don't think it's all that. It's not a Bugatti.
No, I agree. It's an evolved kit car with the latest like of material sciences, but that's what I'm saying. It's like these two, especially the Koenigsegg, but they're really just evolved from early formulas used 20 plus years ago at this point. And it's adding new technologies in, but really there's nothing really that revolutionary about their like initial concept. They're purely internal combustion engines. If you ask both Bugatti and Koenigsegg, I had to look this up before, but these two are the last purely internal combustion engine cars. And when you look at the hypercar scene as it is now, it's actually pretty difficult to find pure internal combustion engine cars. You have to go to, say, Koenigsegg or Pagani or I don't really count it, but the Hennessy Venom F5, they're just sort of just they're sort of just kit cars. They don't have the resources of the really large manufacturers to start producing either hybrids or full EVs. And for the full EVs, they're taking very different forms. So this is actually, in my opinion, the least interesting of the three, because it's really harking back to the past. I mean, now when we talk about the Holy Trinity, which happened, I believe, in 2011, where this was really the start of, hey, like hybrids are more than just Priuses. Hybrids can be used for performance. We already saw it in 2009. 2013. Okay, 2013. Right. In 2009, that's when F1 had introduced the curve system. So it started to make its way into like the every person layman's like idea of, oh, I can use electricity not just to boost my Prius, but also to create a performance gain. And this was like a really big step. This was a step in a direction where two especially established marquees, being Ferrari and Porsche, and then McLaren, who had really just kind of come onto the scene, but they're a pretty storied brand in the area of racing. They were like, hey, we're showing we can use electricity, we can use it for performance, and it can be really fun and interesting, and more than just a nerdy engineering way, because I think the Prius is brilliant, but that's for another time. And so if we go into today's cars, we have a few examples of this formula stretched out, really pushing the limits on terms of what we can do with the internal combustion engine car while being hybridized and modernized. But really they're still internal combustion engine cars. If you were to ask me the definition between this and what we're going to look in a little bit on the pure EVs, they're pretty old formulas, but they're using, in terms of hybridization, just sort of like fill in for more daily drivable parts. So we're going to looking at this Gordon Murray automotive T50 manual gearbox. Obviously the manual gearbox isn't has been around for decades, but the way they're using lightweighting to an incredible degree, and so this is pushing the technical aspect of it. Design wise, it's subjective. I actually don't think that the T50 is very good looking, but it's a derivative of the original F1 concept and just like stretched out in ways.
I mean,
when you hear Gordon Murray talk about it,
I think it's refreshing in that it doesn't look overly angry.
That's true. It's really small. It's really smooth.
Yeah, they're
And
certainly.
it's actually, speaking of that briefly, I think there is like now a movement to make things more simple, which I'm really happy about. I mean, look at Honda's newest design language. It's very, very pulled back and refrained from what they used to be because they were very busy for a sec. BMW is not learning that, and they're all the worse for it. But
They're paying for it.
yeah. But in terms of the T50, it's an old formula in terms of it's basically an F1 brought 2 decades into the future, but you're looking at things that were not able, like the V12 engine you could not produce 20 years ago. There's material sciences and there's processes that just like were not available, and now Gordon Murray's sort of building on the success of how much if the F1 didn't cost $25 million each, I really don't think this car would exist, but now it does, and I think the world is better for it. And then another hypercar which I think was super fascinating is the Valkyrie.
Awesome.
Which I think is the first time a real, like, I know there have been a lot of attempts to be a race car for the road. I hate using that term, but this is like a formula car for the road, because there was that Campari or something, like T something from Top Gear, which was like
The Caparo.
Caparo, yeah, which was just like a
I caught on fire.
like with some like wheel fairings on it, and most of them blew up. And it's really hard to make a formula car like that that can actually drive on the road. When you strip this back, and I really want to dive into this maybe on another time, if you strip that bodywork back, it's really just a formula tub that's been widened a little bit. You look at the cockpit when you open it up, and it's like you can almost see in that, like behind that Mobile One sign where it like curves back in. It just looks like a tub when you remove the when you move all like the wheel fairings and body on it. And it makes sense because it was designed by Adrian Newey and his team, of renowned Formula One designer. But I think that's where it started from. And if it were to be a design concept of, hey, let's make a sedan, it would look very different. But in terms of this, it's like we need to build basically a formula car, and seeing the numbers that it's now producing on the track, which is, I think, an area that a lot of the cars I've talked about now really touch on more than just strictly top speed, because the Chiron, Hennessy doing a 300-mile-an-hour Venom F5 really shows that I think it's that top speed's almost becoming irrelevant. Maybe it will be revitalized, but it's not, at least right now.
Well, I think we're running out of places to do it. Like Koenigsegg has to do it in the Nevada desert.
Yeah.
If there isn't a track
public road
that they can actually go hit their top speed on, they have to use a public road, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, because it's just Volkswagen owns the rights to their test facility, and they're certainly not going to let anyone just like use it unless it's their own product. So yeah, I think it's because it's just so fast that if you're not on the Bonneville Salt Flats or some ridiculous public road in Nevada that they had to call the whole state to shut down, it's almost irrelevant. And it's just like it's not like anyone's really using this anyways. No one's taking their Chiron Super Sport and taking it to 280 plus. It's just bragging rights. But I think now the bragging rights are going to shift. And we're starting to see that more and more. Look at, in terms of this Valkyrie, and it's 17 seconds faster than a Senna around Laguna Seca. It's just absolutely ridiculous. But this is and we've started to see this more with like Nürburgring lap times and focus on track specials more than just like outright top speed, which I think is an evolution in how we're defining the hypercar. Valkyrie is super interesting. It is a hybrid. It uses its electric motors, its reverse gear. Really, really cool. But still, it's based on a V12, a natural gas V12, and that technology aspect, and talking about like how we're looking at each one of these like brand marquees. The emotional aspect of it is that sound. They're not putting turbos on that V12 because they want that NA V12 sound. Same with the T50. And it's, when you hear like enthusiasts talk about cars, oftentimes it's like how it sounds. And it's something that's going to be very difficult when we move into this electrified future. If we're just talking about like pure emotion, art, and it's a completely subjective field, because if you ask non-car enthusiasts, they think it's all just super noisy and annoying, and they don't understand why people can be infatuated by the way a machine sounds. But there is that emotion that some people just like cannot really technically define, as to why they like the way certain things sound. And it's going to be, I think, important. It's why historic racing's really becoming strong. We're looking at like Judd engines, and most of their focus now is to help historic racing. We see Goodwood Revival. We see a bunch of other historical racing series, because we're just like, listening to Formula One V10s or old 787B rotaries, and all these different cars which like spark a certain emotion that a pure EV doesn't. That being said, when we look at this is the first of my two EVs. This is the Rimac, what they say, Concept 2, which is really an evolution of the Concept 1. This, I believe, was like the first real hypercar EV, at least in the modern era. The Concept 1, not the Concept 2, and Rimac as a brand, because when that LaFerrari I showed in the Holy Trinity first came out, the Concept 1 had also come out, and people were just doing basic drag races, and the Concept 1 was demolishing this brand new LaFerrari. And it was really showing the power of electric vehicles. And around the same time, that was when Tesla was coming out with their Model S, and we were starting to see that in the sort of mainstream world, not just this ridiculous hypercar world. So Rimac was starting to show that. We started to see that in terms of like on the business end of Volkswagen starting to absorb Rimac, and a lot of manufacturers taking Rimac's tech and implementing that vehicles, because the proof is in the pudding. The proof is these are way more efficient of technical processes in terms of how we're propulsing ourselves with EVs. They use so much less energy. They're so much faster than everything else. And if we look at how Goodwood, some of the cars that are making their hill climb debuts, most of them are electric. And on that note, we're going to talk about McMurtry Spearling, which I think is one of the most Scott hates looking at it.
The ugliest car I've ever seen. Why?
I disagree. I don't think it's bad looking. I don't think it's particularly good looking, but I do find it super fascinating. And I think that's it's doing something that it's rewriting the books in a lot of different ways. One is not to use like an existing frame, not to use an existing footprint of how we build a car, but this isn't the driver's feet in this picture, as you can like see, is near the front of the car, and there's no internal combustion engine car or internal combustion engine that could ever fit in this sort of package, right? We're totally rewriting it from the ground up. If we go back to the Rimac, I mean, this looks like a conventional car.
Yeah,
looks like a conventional.
I mean, it's almost the same essence of like, you sat in the Mercedes, not on it. This one, it's like
exactly.
God, I hope cars don't look like this complete heinous thing.
It'll be better. Don't worry.
It's so stupid.
But I mean, we're looking at it's almost like growing a propulsion system around a driver now, right? The batteries are being fit underneath him or her, and on the side. That's why you have such a slab-sided slide, is that most of that's batteries. And it's a really interesting package. The concepts around this one driver solution, obviously that's not scalable. We can't just like have this with 4, 5, 6 passenger vehicles, but in terms of this specific package, it made the most sense for their like design. The fan part, it's a concept that was brought up in the GMA T50. It's something that Gordon Murray has touched on a lot. I'm gonna not talk about that because I know it's specific to this car. It's very unique, and it's what was able to make it have such a crazy time up at Goodwood, beating the Volkswagen IDR's record by quite a margin, by almost a second. But reality is we're not going to just see normal cars have or even like hypercars just have a fan system on board. It's just in reality, it's ridiculous. If you ever saw on the street, your eye would probably be poked out by a rock that's flying into your eye. It's just not. I mean, for Goodwood, it's really really cool, but in reality, it's just not gonna.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of on the more extreme end, but it's very much the equivalent of like, we saw Kurz in F1 in 2009. A handful of years later, we saw a version of Kurz in the hybrid Holy Trinity. I think this is probably in maybe more like the 10-year range where they might be able to work it in, but this is very much like the one-off kind of closed course, very like controlled environment kind of experience.
Yeah, I could potentially see it being like in a race series. I mean, the tech's fascinating when you look at this McMurtry specifically. The suction area is no larger than 1 square meter. Like it's not like it's sucking the whole thing down. It's like one little space underneath it and just sucking to that one. It's just in the center of the vehicle. And it's super fascinating. But I agree, it's not, you're not going to see
it. Looks like an MGB race car got smashed into by a fighter jet. It's so heinous.
Honestly, I love it. It looks like a toy. It looks like a toy, and it's real.
They put it next to an Elise, a Lotus Elise, and it made the Elise look like a fucking S-Class. Like it looked so ridiculous next to it because it's like, you strip everything away from the Elise that's not the actual cockpit, and that's basically what it is. It's just like it's just a monocoque on 4 wheels, and it's so ridiculous. I personally love it. It's certainly not the most conventionally beautiful thing, but I to Matt's point, I think the way you described like going from on top of buggy to in car, it's sort of like one of those like rearranging experiences. You don't need an engine in front of you. You don't need to put the batteries in. It's a real rethink of how we're looking at it. And
definitely.
Scott's going to talk about the feature in a little bit, but I think that this was one of the most interesting cars that I've seen in a long time. It made the EV part more interesting, at least to me, in terms of it, seeing it and listening to it go down. And maybe a lot of it had to do with that fan system, but going up Goodwood, it was just, you could like,
well, it was like awesome because it went so fast. Like, I feel you brought up emotion and noise, and that's a thing, but the speed was like awe-inspiring and had emotion.
Yeah, I mean,
Mercury. Like it was genuinely astounding.
The lack of sound was unanimous in that this thing was so alarmingly fast and so alarmingly silent. The crowd stood still in silence because like Coder was saying, it's like it is such a rethink, such a large step forward in terms of like race car propulsion. It was just like, quite literally like awe-inspiring, awe-striking, breathtaking, all of those adjectives.
Gasp. You just could hear the fans sucking the gasp out of everyone's mouth when it passed by,
Yeah, I mean, you heard the pebbles clinking down the road and the gasps, quite literally.
And I don't mean to change this too far in the direction, but the biggest problem we've seen now with like big series racing, I mean, Formula One, NASCAR specifically, I'm going to use those two because the newest regulations that came out this year with Gen 7 NASCARs and the 2022 Formula One series is that they need closer racing, right? They need to stop aerodynamics from going above car, and they're now creating ground effects, which in Formula One's case is being kind of dangerous. But it's the cool thing about the fan car in terms of this is it doesn't rely on aerodynamics coming from the car in front of you. It can just create its own downforce from literally a standstill. It creates 4,400 pounds of I don't understand that. That is
That's
absolute
insane.
lunacy. I just like that number literally sounds made up, but it creates an insane amount of downforce
So-
from literally zero, and it pretty much solves that. I mean, I know this McMurtry has a filter on that fan, so it doesn't just spew out anything that's on the track. But we might be able to see it in the future, that not necessarily looking like this, but maybe in a similar vein for future race series. But it is like such a drastic push, and although I think this leans more into future stuff than my current offerings, which I had mentioned before with these previous cars, I do think this is like the direction now we're going to. The pure internal combustion engine car in my mind is almost completely dead. Besides historic racing, which is actually, I think, going to continue to get stronger and stronger and stronger.
I think that'll get stronger too.
But
I do agree with you, especially watching Goodwood this year. It's dead.
It's
like
dead.
Lucid sent a 4-door massive sedan up the hill faster than supercars.
And
internal combustion is done.
Porsche
When
with
it
the
comes to speed.
GT3 911 car, the GT3R, it went 2 seconds slower than their 718 with full electrical propulsion. And it's just like, like there's one thing to talk about the sound. The sound of the GT3 car is magnificent, but it just like, at a certain point, it will, like, in terms of racing, what I do love about racing, its intentions so pure. It's like, I just need to be faster.
So actually, to that point, Kodera, though, you brought up the art and the culture piece of it. Where it's something I was thinking about when it comes to the future of the hypercar. How do you differentiate yourself as a hypercar manufacturer when you have someone like Rivian making a pickup truck that goes 0 to 60 in like 3 seconds, or Hummer? Like for way less money. So I like, where does, even you talk about top speed, but even on the acceleration end, like where do the hypercar manufacturers go to try to justify costing $4 million?
And I think that's so. The caveat to this episode of being hypercars is I actually don't find the hypercar series that interesting. I much prefer the under 200 grand and under 150 grand segment more interesting, because it's more pertinent to the masses. But you bring a good point, and I think it's a huge reason why when you ask the press releases of any of those companies, whether it's Porsche, Ferrari's a little different, but like Aston Martin or all these, like they're all talking about EVs. That's the move, because you can't sell a car where a Rivian, where a pickup truck that has knobbly tires will just like destroy your car that you claim to be a sports car, especially in a straight line, because that's mostly what people are talking about when they're talking about speed at this point. But it makes the hard argument really difficult, and they have to start digging into their culture of and their history to be able to sell that. I mean, Porsche's been pretty open that all their cars in the future, except the 911, are going to be EVs. I mean, so Panamera is probably going to disappear. It's just going to be Taycan. There's going to be an EV Cayenne, EV Macan, definitely EV 718. But the 911 is basically going to be, hey, like the GT3 even admits, it's just like, hey, we're not even trying to make more powerful engines. It's revs to 9,000. It's like $100,000 race motor in a car that's supposed to be 200 grand, but isn't. And it's just, hey, like this is what it's going to be. Like
it just appeals to emotion.
It just appeals to emotion.
It's the kind of irrational side of motoring.
Yeah, and they're gonna have that irrational, but like emotional. They're gonna, if they just became an EV manufacturer, which a lot of them are. I mean, look at General Motors is claiming all their cars in the future are going to be electric vehicles.
Even Dodge is claiming.
Yeah, even Dodge. Their whole thing has been building the same car for like.
I can't wait to see what their idea of an EV is. It's fantastic.
It's going to be amazing. And that's just like, the 911 hasn't changed for the last 60 years. It's going to stay the same. But they're going to have to evolve it. Eventually, they're going to make a GT3 hybrid and be able to be both. That's another conversation I know we've been talking about for a later discussion, but
Yeah.
it's for the current slew of these sports cars. It's to answer your question, Scott. I think it's pretty difficult, and it's why everyone's taking this stance of, hey, like this is what it's going to be. And
if you want to stay old school, you got to stick to emotion and sell emotion. That's
sell
pretty much it.
emotion.
Because
Yeah.
you're definitely not selling speed.
Yeah, unfortunately, especially with that Spearling. I mean, there was an argument before of like these EVs are just good in a fast line, but a straight line. But now it's Volkswagen's IDR smashing all the records. The Spearling is going to be even faster. Wait till you bring it to Nürburgring, and it's supposed to be. I was like, oh, will the range like not last? And supposedly it can run 30 minutes straight, which is plenty of time for a Nordschleife a lap with a Spearling. It's just not going to be fair anymore. So we'll see where it goes. I'm curious to see like where IMSA and WEC and GT3 and all these like sports car classes are going to go. They're already like kind of not relevant in terms of the whole speed thing, in terms of the streetcar side, because they're all power limited anyways. It's not, they're all like 500 horsepower. So
yeah, I think race series are going to, when they finally can run for endurance, embrace EVs, because it lets you race without irritating your neighbors. Like that's just huge. You can race anywhere.
Yeah.
Formula E kind of proves that point. They have so many street circuits compared to any of their race series because no one cares. It's not noisy. It doesn't bother the people.
Actually, now that I think about it, that's probably a big reason why they don't allow like they don't have street circuits during the V10 era, because it would wake everyone in the 20 mile
deafening for
it's just like I didn't need to be part of this. Like I'm an 84-year-old woman like trying to get a groceries, and I have 20 V10s. Just
your
like,
bones are shaking.
It's a shame because the V6s just don't sound that great, but they can have half their calendar on street circuits. But anyways, I digress. Scott, take it away.
Okay.
With
so you're gonna have to run the pictures because I'm on my phone because of house renovation. But I focused on technology more than specific cars. I think the future of the hypercar, number one, is going to be the 3D printing metal is going to be huge. It's going to allow for optimization and design. It's in just wild geometries. As like AIs drive design. Like the Singer, I think it's a C21. It's CZ ion. If you want to bring that up, that's really like that's the future of the hypercar. They themselves might not last. Who knows? But once big OEMs start to figure this out, especially when the price is no object cars, I know the Chiron has brake calipers, I believe, that are 3D printed.
Yes,
but
that's correct.
It's going to allow for some crazy geometry, especially when the optimization comes from AI and computers for weight and strength. Stuff's going to start to look really organic, which is kind of interesting. Like we're going to go from blocky, kind of chunky, clunky designs, and stuff's just going to become organic and lifelike. Like if you look at this, I was pouring over that Singer, and it looks like it evolved. It doesn't look like it was designed. It looks like it's
I mean it's like a Halo character, but 4 wheels kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Like it just literally looks like it evolved into that shape, like over time. It wasn't just designed to be as it was. It's really cool. I think 3D printing is gonna change the hypercar game.
Definitely.
It's gonna let smaller manufacturers start up and do things. Like instead of needing to get castings, 3D metal printing is really expensive right now, but so is plastic 3D printing 10 years ago.
So is low volume.
As that technology moves, like it's going to allow you to have your Paganis and your Koenigsegg's and the Singer brand to like be able to provide parts when people need them without needing to go get a casting for like create a casting for that part and go through that whole process, but then have to shut that line off when they're done production and kind of make them one-off or create massive inventories before. Like it'll be on demand. And maybe it can be made by like an independent machine shop as the stuff really trickles down, which is really cool. Like serviceability, it was something that I read into, which is why I knew Bugatti kind of changed the game when it came to hypercar serviceability. Pagani is another one where their concierge is just incredible. So Paganis aren't super reliable, but when it needs to be worked on, like they take care of logistics and fly it to the factory for you and fly it back. Like you don't have to deal with the annoyance of trying to find someone to work on your car. Which there's a really interesting interview that I listened to with a guy who had a 959 back in the 90s, and he sold it not because he didn't like it, but because it actively created inconvenience in his life like every other month, because he had to go out of his way to get it serviced. I think even dealing with like Bruce Canepa, who is kind of like the 959 guy in the US, he could work on it, but then you had to get the parts and you had to deal with Porsche. And it was such a debacle that he just got rid of his car, even though he didn't want to get rid of his car. And 3D printing stuff is going to change that, because you won't have to wait on parts from Germany. They can send digital files and someone can make it.
Definitely.
Which is incredibly cool. Yeah, 3D printing. And then the other big piece of technology is just the EV stuff in general. Aerodynamics, like this 3D printing is going to drive some crazy geometry and aerodynamics as well. Like as you're able to 3D print substructure that's truly wild in geometry to let you get crazy with the aero. Because carbon you can lay up in so many different ways. It's flexible from the start, and you can just mold it.
But when you start seeing
those two things combined.
Speaking on that, like let's dive into that material science end a little bit, because in terms of carbon fiber, like it has become like a little bit more accessible, and we're starting to see it in more mainstream stuff, but it's really not at the point where you're just like seeing normal everyday things in carbon fiber.
Yeah, it's not there. We're talking about hypercars still, but it's become the choice for creating hypercars, and it really started in niche operations. Like you had a Kevlar body on the F40, you had race car parts being laid up in it, like by hand probably for the race cars.
Oh yeah.
And Bugatti kind of evolved the carbon tub thing. And hopefully with 3D printing, you still have to deal with, when you have the carbon tub with metal, like aluminum, extruded aluminum, like space frames and stuff like that, you're still limited by the extruded aluminum on crazy geometries. Like aluminum can only be cast so many ways. Like you can machine stuff to be pretty impressive, but it's really expensive because you'd have to waste so much material.
Yeah, but then even then, subtractive manufacturing, you're limited by what you can do too. I mean, you can't.
Yeah, exactly. It's still, you're still dealing with the limits of like a 5-axis CNC machine. And 3D printing, you get rid of that. It's additive. You can do pretty much whatever you want, whatever shape your heart desires, you can do. So you'll be able to have that carbon tub, and then incredibly intricate aluminum substructures on either side, which then lets you do even wackier aero, because for the same strength, you can do this crazy shape that allows some wing to be supported over here that you couldn't do with an extruded aluminum. That wouldn't be possible, or it just require so much material that it'd be disadvantageous because of weight.
It's the most
3D printing is going to be insane.
Yeah, 3D printing is, I think it's I almost not talked about enough in the car world. It's talked about almost everywhere, but especially I think the Zinger 21C is actually, I talked about this a couple of years ago. I think it was 3 years ago. I was just oogling over it when they first announced it, and Top Gear did a special on like the facilities and then the benefits of additive manufacturing and the scalability of just having the scalability and flexibility, which you touched on, of just like being able to just have a unit the size of like a small warehouse that could just produce whatever you possibly
Yeah, and
want.
it's the same thing with with the EVs. Like I thought when I went down this path, I was like, oh, someone in a shed with money, but someone in a shed can do this. It's this kind of the same with EVs in the fact that once a manufacturer makes a basic skateboard, just like when they make a basic platform now, they can shrink it, they can widen it, they have some flexibility with that platform. And when you take away the emissions part of it, which let's face it, on supercars, emissions is probably a huge issue with no longer or not being able to greenlight the project. If you can just change that skateboard to how you want it, it then lets you do something really wild and throw more power at it, and create something really unique. So the low volume stuff becomes more attractive. So when you combine,
one thing I have heard is, speaking of like past and presents and how things have been coming around, is the skateboard, which you're talking about. I mean, cars in the 30s and the 20s, like they were built on just a frame, and you would have a coach builder come in, whether it was touring or Pininfarina. I know I'm messing up my timelines, but you had coach builders that built a car on top of a chassis, and with the whole trend has been like now we're going back almost to like, we're not going to have the research and development of some tiny boutique manufacturer like Touring or any of these like Italian designers to build a skateboard, but they can build like the bodywork on top of it to be unique. And this is in terms of like, if we're going to focus on the hypercars, because I think I definitely started straying away from it. You know, we need to find ways for rich people to to show themselves off, right? And it's gonna move away from just like these bespoke, just Koenigseggs or whatever. And now you hired this one guy to create a one-off car, but you didn't have
there's that component, but I think people also eat up these like limited production cars from big OEMs, and those skateboard designs and like company corporate platforms, being able to shape them into like a hypercar and sell it at low production volumes. More of those projects should be able to get greenlit in an EV world where you're going to pass emissions. You already have the basic platform. It's not like you have to design a new chassis and then figure out, like the Ford GT, right? You have to design a new chassis in 2005 and then fit an engine from your truck, give it more power so that it feels like a supercar, but then still go past emissions with it and crash test that chassis.
Yeah,
like
it's just too much.
When you use the skateboard and you can optimize with 3D printing, it lets you can optimize for the crash test just way better. Like 3D printing lets you do whatever shape you want on top of the skateboard. If you do 3D printed body on top of the skateboard chassis, you can do whatever shape you want to optimize for crash tests. Like your theoretical, the amount you can do with just software and engineering overhead before you actually have to make something will just get you so much further. Like the business case becomes easier for these low volume hypercars, I think.
Yeah, 100%.
15 years, which is really cool. It means we might get more special one-offs from big OEMs, and you'll have your boutique coach build stuff in sheds that'll still hopefully pass crash testing and still pass emissions because there isn't any.
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
We're heading into a really exciting time. If you're okay with EVs, it's going to be a really exciting time.
Yeah, right. Definitely a kind of big asterisk on that.
And and those are the 2 points I really like that you touched on those, because EVs. I'm curious where it's going to move into. I think the biggest, although I was just showing on the slide the Lucid Power Unit, which is like, and then Teslas for the Plaid, they've been talking about their carbon fiber rack stator or something ridiculous like that. But I think the real telltale sign will be how batteries will be produced. how they're going to be manufactured and like the actual energy density for them without exploding in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Um, it, it's gonna like really, it's really gonna set the bar for it. I think that's the nice thing about hypercars, and we're gonna finish on this note, is that they've always been an extravagant display of some sort of like technology. And oftentimes they'll push in directions which might not be moving the bar forward as much. It's more just like a show of excess when you have your your Mansory versions of whatever. But I think the beauty of it is that there can be a display of where the future can look. The Zinger 21 is a great ending point. But going back to my original question, Matt, what is a hypercar to you? Have you thought about that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, to be completely honest, I think you kind of just stole the words right from my mouth. Not in a bad sense at all. I think that is an excellent kind of summarization. That it's as we dissected here. There's a swath of criteria that you could look at throughout the evolution of the automobile, that you could say, oh well, this is a hypercar, or this is a hypercar, whether it's top speed or horsepower or sort of a lot of those bragging rights things. I would argue, kind of as you brought up, the art, the design. The Bugatti Atlantique Coupe is made of magnesium, and it is a horrible automobile, but is widely regarded as one of the most beautiful creations of machine ever. And I think in some essence, you could say that's a hypercar. It certainly trades at hyper figures. It's like probably $30-something million car at this point. So I think as we enter this era of frankly asinine speeds, like faster than you can think speeds, and we kind of get away from the emotional sound portion, it really is going to come down to things like the design, what kind of design or design language or materials does the vehicle evoke or kind of promote, and it's going to be a shift, but ultimately I think it is still going to be, how could you say, categorical. So the McMurdy, crazy fast, that's a hypercar. The Hummer EV, I think you could also call that a hypercar, because it has those headliner statistics. And in the same vein,
that's just an interesting take.
Just kind of using tangible examples, as you tangentially mentioned, something like a Park Ward Bentley from the 50s that was a coach built body, that's now an EV and has freshly reupholstered interior, and it has LED backlit gauges, and a dial that says power reserve, and it's battery powered. I mean, that to me is also a hypercar, because it probably has a hyper price tag, and it kind of fits that category. So that's not the most concise description.
It is a broad definition of hypercar.
But yeah, but I think the hypercar has always been kind of broad, and I think it's not getting any narrower anytime soon, especially as we see something like the McMurdy can compete in terms of like sheer audacity as a Hummer EV.
In very different ways. One's a very British way of looking at it, and one's a very
American way of
once Americans start, I guess maybe the Tesla Roadster, and like the fact it didn't exist the second one, not the first one. Maybe that's like the definition on the American end, but I agree. It's there's no real people like to put definitions to what a hypercar, supercar even is, and I find it ridiculous when someone tries to go like, oh, well, a hypercar is this and a supercar is that. It's like, no, it's the same thing. It's just like you're categorizing it by price point. None of that matters.
I don't know about that. I think there's definitely a difference. I'll wait to say that difference. So it's my turn.
No, go into it. I told my definition of what a hypercar is.
I mean, I think like a supercar is like a GT3 or a Ferrari or a Huracan Performante. Like it's meant to let the driver have fun. And I think a hypercar is purely designed to let engineers have fun and little kids have fun. So like they exist purely for little kids to argue about at school and for the engineers to have a blank check and do what they want to do. I think they become a vessel for rich people to show off, but that's not how any of them are birthed or how anyone wants it to be. Like Ferdinand Piech, when he commissioned the Veyron to begin production, there's no way he wanted to actually make money with it. It wasn't to be a vessel for rich people to show off. It wasn't a business case. It was to show what Volkswagen was capable of. And I think that's what hypercars always are. If the car is made for being crazy, like the Valkyrie is another example. Like it's genuinely insane.
I have 2 points. I like what you're saying. I totally agree. But I have 2 points, and I really want to hear your response. So the first one is where would you categorize something like a Zonda? Because it's not necessarily the fastest, but it is definitely, it kind of touches on all those aspects.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Like, is a Zonda a supercar because it is a driver's car, or is it a hypercar because it's $3 million? It's entirely carbon. It's got this crazy tuned Benz engine.
I mean, I don't really think about Pagani or Koenigsegg all that much. To be honest, like I think people like to think Koenigsegg is pushing the boundaries of technology. I don't think he is as much as like Mate Rimac or whoever's doing that crazy stuff at Singer. It's, I don't know. A Pagani to me is a very expensive supercar. Okay. It might be letting the artists have fun. Like I think Pagani is a really great artist and he blends art and engineering really well. But I don't know. And it's going to be really interesting when someone like him is allowed to adopt 3D, like metal 3D printing and create really incredible shapes.
Yeah.
Like the clamshell is going to hide some very pretty things on a Pagani when 3D printing is the norm for Pagani.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a bit.
The other part of the hypercar, I realized looking at the Singer, is its appeal to your art and emotion talk from earlier today. Like as we move into EVs and we lose the sound part of the emotion, I think looking at the details on some of the 3D printed parts in the Chiron and the Singer, I think people like to talk about current cars as being living things and internal combustion cars as having a soul. But in 10 years, like the pinnacle of cars are going to look more like living things than cars have ever looked ever.
That's right.
Like they're genuinely going to look like living things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like those parts have a quality that is uncanny about them. And I think the emotion is going to come from the blend, like Pagani, the blend of the art and the engineering, and it looking like a living thing and interacting with it like a living thing, because they're going to look drastically different.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that just briefly, like the way we're talking about. To answer your question, Matt, I do think it's a hypercar. I think it's a very specific terms. I hate to use the term art because art can be so even more broad than how we're defining hypercar.
Right.
Let's say Pagani hits on that target. I think they are hypercar because they're pushing that art boundary. But in terms of what I mean by art, it's like how we look at Art Deco from the early 20s, right? Of like a
Yeah.
very specific type of art. But if
Right.
you look at the Zinger or like some of these other, I'm going to mention the Zinger specifically, but the way it's reframed is art in itself, right? We're looking at it's biomimicry, it's all these like new terms that's not just, you look at the Pagani, it's like, okay, it's the most elaborate way to like create a billet subtractive manufacturing version of Huayra, the badge. It take like 100 hours on the badge.
Yeah.
It's they're hammering away at this one like really old school sort of method about going about it. But then, we look at how art changed from like the 1920s to like 1950s, and you look at I'm gonna move this out of cars, but we look at like industrial mid-modern design, right, versus Art Deco. It's such a different design philosophy,
Yeah.
but it's still art, right? And since we're pushing that boundary, and the way I envision, I just had like a little snippet. I'm imagining Goodwood in some like spindly like car that looks like an alien, that looks like not even Halo. It looks like some ridiculous like sci-fi thing that's going out in complete silence, right? That doesn't look like a letterbox like the McMurtry. It looks like, you know, it looks like something from like the Avatar movie, and it looks like,
Yeah.
a being moving around, and people are going like, what the hell is that? And it's obviously going to be silent and EV and whatnot, but it's going to move that boundary in something that we've never seen before, but could only be created using additive manufacturing or whatever battery technology at the time.
Yeah.
Maybe it has some sound from some new battery that somehow makes a bunch of sound, or something. Who knows? I don't know. It's going to be a little bit till then, but it's answer your question. It is a hypercar. I think the art part is going to be even more. Art and design is going to be such a huge thing, and
Yeah.
in turn, it's not one as mutually exclusive to the tech or the speed or anything, but it's just such a cool like avenue. I can't wait to like see it.
Definitely.
And yeah, should we end there?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end. If you made it this far, thank you so much. We realize this is one of the longer ones, but this is obviously a very broad topic. Let us know your comments. Feel free to say if you have a favorite hypercar, or if you want to see a direction that we're going in terms of the hypercar. Also, feel free to drop a comment if there's a particular era or decade that you'd love to see us talk about next. Again, I could go on about Duesenbergs for a zillion years, and I love the 30s and Art Deco and etc. But of course, happy to talk about 50s, 60s, 70s, pretty much anything. That's why we talk about cars for fun for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours at a time. But yeah, I think this is a good stopping point. Thank you, fellas. Thank you, listeners. And we'll catch you on the next one.